united forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, the dream of a people, their fortress secure. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand.
They were identified as being special. They were given special treatment.
To
this day, if you ask an averagely educated Russian, name some famous black person from Russian history, they will probably mention Abram Ganibal, who lived at the beginning of the 18th century, and whom they know about because he was an ancestor of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's national writer. But there were hardly any black people of any renown who did anything sufficiently noteworthy for people to know about them, really until the 1920s, when American black people started going to Soviet Russia.
Коммунистические пропагандисты говорили, что буржуазная демократия – это вывеска. И за этой вывеской на самом деле власть буржуазии, власть капиталистов, власть денежного мешка. Надо сказать, что в значительной степени так и было. Они обещали что-то новое, они обещали новое общество.
My grandmother was named Williana Jones, and then she married a man named Charles Burroughs, so she became Williana Jones Burroughs. They were activists for better rights for black people in general. And so she became more and more interested in the Soviet Union and more and more interested in going there. And she started going to the international congresses of the Communist Party. But then, I think it was 1929 when she actually went to the one in the Soviet Union.
There was a special interest in blacks in the first place, is that Lenin himself proclaimed that this is a part of humanity that's a very good symbol of what's wrong with capitalism and imperialism. And so blacks were singled out as a good illustration, especially of what the leading capitalist economies were doing. They needed skilled labor to come in and try to build their economy. They wanted to be one of the world's leading economies. They recruited thousands of Americans, and they were able to do this in part because the Great Depression had come about in the West. So they were recruiting people from every place.
Of course, the industrialization process of Russia economy, of Soviet Russia economy, was impossible without technology coming from the United States. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was taking certain political decisions.
And it was finally realized that the Russians knew a lot more about us than we knew about them. You need to know your enemy, right? They saw that the race problem in the United States was a convenient example to hold up to the world.
Black bodies swinging.
It was very attractive to certain individuals who were adventurous enough to try someplace else, even if they weren't sure what it was going to be like.
Я полечу отсюда быстрее птиц домой.
Я родился в России, тогда это был Советский Союз, мои родители из Америки. Папа у меня черный американец, мама белая американка. Вот они приехали, здесь познакомились, они не знали в Америке друг друга. И родили меня и сестру, которая сейчас уже в Америке, а вот я здесь. Когда он приехал сюда, он увидел, что огромное количество людей, и в первую очередь женщин, просто боготворили его. Здесь он получил такую порцию внимания, что он поехал в первую очередь за этим вниманием, понимая также, что из этого он извлечет еще и рабочую пользу.
Масса, капитан. Разрешите мне выбрать этого повара на завтрак акулам. В последнее время он мало интересует.
They found that in societies where class was more important than color, W.E.B. Du Bois called them the talented tenth.
Меня зовут Елена Ханга, и мои бабушка и дедушка приехали в 28 году из Америки, из Нью-Йорка в Советский Союз, а точнее их отправили в Узбекистан. Мой дедушка, поскольку он был афроамериканец, а моя бабушка была белая, польская еврейка, они бежали от расизма. А мой дедушка был специалистом по хлопку. Он же из Миссисипи сам. Поэтому он и поехал в Ташкент, где, как мы знаем, вот житница вся хлопка. Именно в это время Советский Союз закупал машины перерабатывающие, и он обучал узбекских специалистов, хлопкоробов, как правильно механизированно обрабатывать хлопок.
There was on the one hand Soviet propaganda, and then there was the reality of life in the Soviet Union. And so what would they have known? The country was too new. The Bolshevik regime was too unknown. They said one thing and did another. They could be very welcoming to Claude McKay at the same time that they've opened the Solovki concentration camp in the north and are killing off and driving out members of social classes that they didn't like.
There were some common features in our respective histories.
Black Americans have been fighting for their independence, for equality, for the 430 years that they have been on the American continent.
Some people say we got a lot of malice, some say it's a lot of nerve. But I say we won't quit moving until we get what
you draw that with, the Russians and Soviets, there was this idea of fighting against oppression.
A number of cultural features were things I could identify with. In fact, Negro spirituals and some of the Russian traditional folk songs, I immediately recognized as having a relationship.
The Russians never tried to enslave black people. They enslaved their own peasantry by transforming them into serfs. So the status of blacks in Russia was unique in that regard.
And this lasted all the way up into the end of the Soviet era in many respects, because the public was conditioned to enforce official doctrine as long as the Communist Party was all powerful. That ideological protection, backed up by the police state, enforced a certain kind of behavior that made it safe for Africans to roam the streets any day or night. Now it's very dangerous.
Русские вперед! Русские вперед!
To hold fast to dreams. For if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow.
Alexander Pushkin was born in Moscow on the 6th of June, 1799, the son of a retired army major, Sergei Lvovich Pushkin. The earliest documented evidence of Pushkin's ancestors suggests that they had close ties with Prince Alexander Nevsky. His father, Sergei Lvovich Pushkin. His mother, Nadezhda Osipovna, was the granddaughter of the famous General-in-Chief Hannibal, an officer who served under Peter the Great, and a descendant of a high-ranking princely family who had hailed from Ethiopia. What you see before you could have been one of Pushkin's first impressions of Moscow as he walked through the squares and along the boulevards, accompanied by his governor, Nikita Kozlov, watching its street life, climbing the Ivan the Great, the Belfry Tower, to survey the panorama of the city. During the summer, the family went to a country estate at Zakharova. Pushkin was to write about this experience. Look at the Russian peasant. Is there a trace of a slave's humility in the way he conducts himself or the way he speaks? As for his courage and intelligence, they can never be doubted. As a boy, Pushkin used to love to listen to the songs and the fairy tales of his nanny, Irina Rodionovna. His childhood years ended when at the age of 12 he was sent to school in Petersburg. Suddenly, everything was new, different and exciting. The lifestyle of the capital was to be immortalized in his writings. Pushkin was admitted to the Lyceum, a privileged school for the young gentry of aristocratic birth. The emperor was perspicacious enough to realize that being brought up in the spirit of loyalty to the monarchy, the graduates from the Lyceum would be ideal candidates for important government positions. Thus, the best teachers in Russia were employed at the establishment. Pushkin's closest friend at the Lyceum recalled, "We all realized that Pushkin was way ahead of us, that he'd read material we hadn't even heard of. But he was never a show-off. Alexander Pushkin was popular and on good terms with his fellow students." (1812) and the start of a popular war against the aggressive invasion of Napoleon's army. Life at the Lyceum became a blend of academic and political activities. Young students influenced by the fact that this was their first awareness of a military conflict, the events having a great effect on their innocence. Young Pushkin had an early, unique opportunity to understand the significance of a war on this scale, to experience pride in his homeland. Yekaterinsky Park. It was here that Pushkin loved to walk. It was here he would come to find inspiration. Poetry became Pushkin's main preoccupation in life. In 1814, his first poem, "To My Versifier Friend," was published. It was in this room at the Lyceum that Pushkin experienced the initial excitement of becoming a poet. Everything in the room has been preserved exactly as it was during his lifetime. During the final examinations at the Lyceum in 1815, the famous Russian poet Derzhavin heard Pushkin recite his poem. As Pushkin later recalled, "Finally they called my name, and I read my recollections of Zaskoy Silo, standing just 2 paces away from the great man. I do not even remember finishing the reading, least of all where I went when I ran out of the room. Derzhavin was so delighted, he wanted to hug me. Pushkin was recognized as the hope of Russian literature by both Batyushkov and Vyazemsky, the foremost authors of the time. And Zhukovsky wrote of Pushkin, "We should all unite to help this future giant, for he will outgrow us all." After graduation, Pushkin settled in Petersburg. He was given a job at the Foreign Office, but a career as a diplomat held no attraction for him. Soon Pushkin was immersed in the social life of the capital. Society and literary functions, the theater, and extravagant balls took up all his time. He was a cheerful, friendly, and extremely popular young man. Yet he never lost sight of the other face of Russia, the lawlessness, the oppression of serfdom. Social change was a prime objective of several secret societies set up by the Russian nobility at that time. These aristocrats realized that people who had fought and won a hard war were entitled to their freedom. The ideas and aspirations of this revolutionary nobility were encouraged and fostered by the poems of Alexander Pushkin. The emperor was furious. He decreed that Pushkin had flooded Russia with scandalous poetry and must be sent into exile. Pushkin was banished from St. Petersburg to the southern reaches of the Caucasus, where he was to spend 4 years away from home, separated from family and friends. A new life opened up for Pushkin. The Caucasus left an indelible impression on the mind of the poet. He wrote to his brother, "I wish you could have seen with me the sheer magnificence of these mountains." Aboard the brig, the Mangrelia, Pushkin made a trip to the Crimea. This is the house in which he stayed. Upon rising in the morning, I saw an enchanting view. The multicolored mountains were sparkling in the sunlight. All around, clear blue sky and fresh southern air. In Gurchov, I lived quietly, swam in the sea, and gorged myself on grapes. I loved to wake up at night and spend hours just listening to the murmur of the sea. Along this path, Pushkin traveled to the former capital of the Crimean Khans, Bakhchisarai. During a visit to the palace, he heard of a legend about the love of a Bakhchisarai Khan for a young Polish captive called Maria. From this he conceived a romantic poem which he called The Fountain of Bakhchisarai. On the last leg of his travels, the banished poet arrived at Moldavia, Kishinev. He settled in this house, and it was here that he was to spend the remainder of his term in exile and to start work on his poem, The Gypsies. But here in the south, too, Pushkin met up with young liberals, members of a secret Southern society who were making plans for an armed uprising. Secret agents of the emperor reported to the capital that Pushkin was publicly abusing not only his military superiors, but the government itself. He was accused of grave misconduct and banished until further notice to his family estate in the village of Mikhailovskoye in the Pskov district. Pushkin was back on the road. Another new world opening up to him, new faces, scenes, impressions, all changing in rapid succession. Back in the country of his ancestors, Pushkin felt a deep sense of belonging, a strong affinity with his homeland. Pushkin was to write, "My nanny is my only friend. Of all people, she's the only one I am never bored by." Pushkin admired the folk tales and the fairy tales that his nanny would endlessly recount to him. Many of them inspired some of his own poems. The tale of Tsar Sultan, the tale of the fisherman and the fish, the tale of the dead Tsarina and the 7 warriors. Pushkin remained in this house for 2 years. This is the poet's study, which has been reconstructed to show exactly how he lived at that time. Some of his personal belongings are preserved here. Pushkin wrote to his brother, "Do you know what I do? I write till noon. I have dinner quite late. And for God's sake, send me some books, as many as possible." The poet found the markets a mine of creative inspiration. He would visit them dressed as one of the locals, noting down folk songs, fairy tales, sayings, and chatting to the peasants. Not far from Mikhailovskoye was Petrovskoye, the estate of Pushkin's great-grandfather, Hannibal. Many of his documents and belongings have survived to this day. The Petrovskoye estate had been granted to Hannibal by the Empress Elizabeth. Here is his coat of arms and his charter. Pushkin's interest in the history of his family was inextricably linked to the history of Russia as a whole. I feel that my spiritual forces have now matured and that I can create. Here Pushkin read chronicles, old manuscripts, documents, all relating to the troubled times of the early 17th century, the reign of Boris Godunov. It was at this desk that he wrote the tragedy, Boris Godunov, 4 chapters of the novel, Eugene Onegin, and dozens of poems. In 1825, the December uprising took place in St. Petersburg. Pushkin was deeply shocked to learn of those sent into exile, and in particular of the execution of its leaders, which included some of his closest friends. He wrote in the margin of one of his manuscripts, "It could have been me." Pushkin was summoned to Moscow to meet the new emperor, Nicholas I, who asked Pushkin, would he have joined in the uprising if he had been in St. Petersburg at the time? Pushkin replied, yes, all my friends had been in the conspiracy and I could never have remained on the sidelines. Despite this, the Tsar was anxious to win favor with the now famous poet and allowed him to return from exile. In the winter of 1828, Pushkin met Natalia Goncharova and immediately fell desperately in love. He proposed, was accepted, and moved to his family estate in the village of Boldino to prepare for his marriage. People usually get married at 30. I shall be no exception, and I'm sure I will not live to regret it. After what has happened in the past, there can be no unpleasant surprises, only joyful and happy ones. It is nearly autumn, my favorite season of the year. I usually seem to feel healthier in the autumn. It's when I create most of my poems. During the late summer months of 1830 and 1834, Pushkin was to stay on at Boldino and write prodigiously. The most fruitful year being 1830, an autumn of inspiration. This is the house where the poet lived, now recreated to reflect the atmosphere and the ambience of the place in which he worked. Here the poet finished the novel Eugene Onegin. Written in verse, it had taken him several years to complete and was hailed by the critics as an encyclopedia of Russian life. On the 18th of February, 1831, Pushkin and Natalia Goncharova were married in this church. Pushkin wrote to a friend in St. Petersburg, "I'm married and happy, and my only wish is that nothing changes. I will never live to see a happier time." It was not long, however, before the emperor again summoned Pushkin, this time to take up permanent residence at his court. Two years later, the poet was to complain that St. Petersburg was not for him, that he had no leisure time in which to work, that his days were being monopolized by a social whirl in which his wife was very much involved. Despite these protestations, he actually continued to work a great deal. A friend of Pushkin described the poet as a workaholic, only really calm and relaxed when he was writing. In these archives, Pushkin worked on the history of the peasants' uprising led by Yemelyan Pugachev in the 18th century. Trying to understand and relate the past to the present, the poet studied the period of greatest change in Russia, the reign of Peter the Great. He incorporated this research in such masterpieces as The Bronze Horseman, and the captain's daughter. Pushkin received permission to publish a literary magazine, Sovremennik, in which he utilized the talent of the best creative minds in Russia. In his own contributions, Pushkin was dedicated to upholding national originality, realism, and the patriotism of art. Pushkin's privileged position was to make him enemies in court circles. Soon, a malicious persecution of the poet began. Slanderous insinuations, scandalous allegations concerning his private life. What was lacking was a catalyst to further this blind hatred to a logical conclusion, someone to speak out publicly, forcing Pushkin to demand satisfaction. The role was assumed by a Frenchman in the service of the court, a man named Dantes. In his flat, Pushkin's last residence in St. Petersburg, everything is maintained exactly as it was during his lifetime. Portraits of his children and his wife. The sitting room, where his close friends would often sit down with him to discuss, to argue, to laugh together. The poet's favorite belongings. Sitting at his desk, Pushkin wrote his last letter 1 hour before the duel. On January the 27th, 1837, he was mortally wounded. On January the 29th, 1837, at 2:45 p.m., just 38 years old, the heart of the poet stopped.
О, мощный властелин судьбы, не так ли ты над самой бездной, на высоте, уздой железной Россию поднял на дыбы? Или вот еще, и зубы стиснув, пальцы сжав, как обаянной силой черной, добро, строитель чудотворный, шепнул он злобно задрожав, ужо тебе! И вдруг, стремглав, бежать пустился. Показалось ему, что грозного царя мгновенно гнева возгоря лицо тихонько обращалось, и он по площади пустой бежит и слышит за собой, как будто грома, крохотанье, тяжелозвонкое скаканье по потрясенной мостовой. Государь! И озарен луною бледной, простерши руку в вышине, за ним несется всадник медный на звонко скачущем коне.
Celebrations are planned across Russia to celebrate the anniversary of Alexander Pushkin's 209th birthday. He'll be commemorated by the erection of a new monument in his honor in Moscow. Poetry readings and wreath layings are expected at major cities throughout the country. Alexander Pushkin was born in 1799 and is considered to be Russia's greatest writer and the founder of modern Russian literature. Born in Moscow and educated among the elite, Pushkin gradually became committed to social reform. In the early 1820s, he clashed with the government and was exiled to southern Russia. Later, he returned to the court, but was constantly under surveillance. Pushkin had 4 children from his marriage to Natalia Goncharova. He died in a duel at the age of 38.
Hello and welcome back. The challenge of responding to racial tension is something that many nations have had to face. In Russia, though, the problem is exacerbated by the actions of ultra-nationalist far-right extremists, fringe groups whose racist rhetoric is aimed at stirring up hatred against immigrants and others. Against this background, the small black community in Moscow has been the victim of numerous racially motivated attacks, and its members are increasingly fearful of what will happen in the future. But what about the extremists behind this vicious xenophobia? N.Hobbs has tracked down one such group, the self-styled and openly neo-Nazi Slavic Union.
Dmitry Dyomushkin is the leader of the neo-Nazi group, the Slavic Union, one of the few not to have been banned by the authorities under anti-extremist legislation. But its racist ideology is gaining support amongst young Russians, and society is increasingly passively accepting the neo-Nazi groups.
Понимаете, я не могу говорить вам в камеру, да, что вот я считаю, что.
Galina Kožennikova monitors racist crimes in Russia.
Да, потому что как бы это обвинение просто уголовное преступление. Но то, что он имеет отношение там к насилию, безусловно.
In order to understand this further, I realized I had to try and meet Dyomushkin himself.
Вы к нам, да?
I found him meeting some new recruits.
А что, собственно, Африка дала мировой цивилизации? Ну, кроме СПИДа, блядь, естественно. Да нифига она не дала. Они как были дикие обезьяны, так дикими обезьянами и остались.
Вы поддерживаете то, что, в смысле, в моральном смысле, то, что...
И знаете, я вам скажу так. Я понимаю тех людей, которые совершают эти преступления по своей там молодости, горячности. Я понимаю мотивацию в поступках.
Dmitry treads a fine line between what he can say without going to prison, but his intentions to me are clear.
Есть пистолет, есть нож, есть машинный как бы вариант, вот, как бы ножа отдельный. Вот. Как бы такой вот, бля. Глядеть боевую готовность молодежного подразделения Южного Бутова.
Over 25 million Russians died in the Second World War in the fight to vanquish the disease of Nazism from the planet. It is ironic, therefore, that Russia, according to some sources, has over half the world's neo-Nazis, and people like Dmitry are trying to instill Nazism in Russia's new generation.
Не они воевали в прошлом за эту землю. Пусть учатся в своей Зимбабве, блядь, и делают, что хотят.
Резче, Андрюха, удар.
Вот так. Ну что, намяли по дружбе друг друга, ебали, хорошо.
Развивается очень сильная ксенофобия по отношению ко всем не похожим на русских, так сказать.
Svetlana Ganushkina runs an NGO that assists refugees who find themselves stuck in Russia.
Это процесс, который, к сожалению, не останавливается, а приобретает все более и большую силу.
Давнейшее, в 2006 году сняла как бы нападение на лицо неславянской внешности. Смотрите, он пойдет. Я сама! Не бойся! Все, стоп!
Первоначально было подозрение в совершении 37 убийств, насколько я помню СМИ. Позднее судом, по-моему, 25 определено было, да?
Да где-то так. Ну, что-то было доказано, что-то не доказано.
Ну, групп таких много, всяких вот в районах независимых, маленьких, действующих по принципу, да, нападений. Ну.
Нам нужно бороться. Бороться надо, выселять, только бороться. Выселять, отправить обратно. Значит, надо принимать более жесткие меры.
С интервью завязывай уже, все. No comment.
I could sense that Dmitry was getting nervous. I had already filmed him and his group in numerous violations of Russian law, inciting racial hatred and demeaning ethnic dignity. But when I tried to find out if it was these youth who were behind some of the attacks, Dmitry suddenly stopped the interview. But not all Russian youth are like this, and not every black person in Moscow is intimidated. These two DJs from Cameroon, Maxi G and Judge, are off to play a club night. Their rapping is proving to be a hit in a country that until a few years ago had only ever seen rap in American films.
Yeah, I feel safe inside the car. That's why I'm in my car now, because I feel safe.
I know
is going to work out here, sure, because the population here, they already, especially the youth, they very much like the shit. When we're doing the show, you see how them feel the beat, they're on the dance floor. For them, it's like, it's so enticable. It's like something very new in their life, something they never see before.
Young Russian women have been attracted by the glamour of African-American music, and Africans like DJ Maxi G have cultivated this image.
Как ни странно, хотя может быть и не странно, у нас много именно русских девушек. Вот, то есть темнокожие парни и русские девушки. То есть музыка все-таки интернациональная, объединяет всех.
All my life I've listened to black rap from 14 years old. Only black rap.
Я вот пытался в свое время слушать, но музыка непонятная. Ну, даже музыка назвать невозможно. Это просто набор слов. Бесполезный набор слов, который там призывает к бандитизму, к наркотикам, к алкоголю, к спиртному, то есть ко всему этому.
Например, есть такое направление, там регги, да, каждый растаман, все знают, должен вкладывать наркотики обязательно.
The lovers, they love the black music, the girls here.
We like to party. Yeah,
just
and they like to party, so let's party, let's go party.
Hey, check this out. You want to see the dollars? Want to see how the black guys live in Moscow? Want the cash? It's the cash, man.
Gotta go.
It's not drug money. It's hard-working money.
But Russia's growing population of mixed-race children are finding it tough to be accepted as Russians by their own people. George is a young mixed-race boy growing up in Moscow.
Как ты чувствуешь себя, когда они говорят, что ты из Африки?
Приятно. Просто если еще из России, мне просто неприятно, когда так говорят.
Ну, у Жоржа была история, когда он себя рисовал белым. Потом подошла и сказала: Жорж, ты же такой классный.
Это серьезно?
Да. Просто мне нравится больше белый цвет.
Почему?
Ну, так лучше просто.
Не знаю, почему Жорж так говорит. Я очень стараюсь Жоржу говорить, что он самый красивый и самый любимый, и я его очень люблю.
Amelia runs a charity which provides a social network for children like George. Others were abandoned in orphanages by mothers too ashamed of their children's colour.
They're very happy when they're together. Before they did not know each other, and it's not easy for the children, you know, to be black in Russian schools, you know, because there are not many. This girl Anna, she is not from Moscow. She stayed in one village close to Tula. She was just one black in a big region, you know. And like grandfather told me a story that some of the schools used to make like a field trip or excursions to that kindergarten to see the black child, to see the Negro, Negritanka in Russian.
But the neo-Nazis see mixed-race children as the thin end of the wedge in what they see as the pollution of Russia's blood and culture.
Будут самые мулаты, их дети везде лазить. Во всех детских садиках, в школах, а потом и в вузах. И все, и ничего не будет. Будут афроамериканцы, будут рэп играть и везде и слушать.
Back in the woods, it seems that the locals have a naive acceptance of the neo-Nazi groups.
Вот собачка. Она тоже черненькая, как негр. Ну, хорошая собачка. Черненькая собачка. Они не расисты, они не расисты тоже. Они просто как бы, они как бы сейчас немножко Россию унижают, немножко унижают, да? Вот давление идет на Россию какое-то, извини, идет давление, это неправильно тоже.
Раньше комсомол был,
Так, Аль,
а сейчас его нету. Пионеры были, нету.
This picture of Soviet Union. This is like a дружба, you know, friendship. We are together. Yeah, that was a great time for Africans.
Весь ужас нашей сегодняшней ситуации состоит именно в том, что это не маргиналы. Эти люди, которые убивают и избивают не славян, там, темнокожих, азиатов и так далее, эти люди опираются на мощнейшую поддержку общества. Вот. И транслировать в общество уже нечего, общество уже давно восприняло эти взгляды.
It's been only a few decades since Africans first appeared in Russia. And what seemed like a promising start to interrace relations is fast degenerating into a tragedy of farce and deadly intent. As communism becomes ever more a memory and Russians look to the future, the question remains whether this is the kind of society that Russians truly want.
And that's it for this edition of People in Power. If you'd like to comment on this report or any other matter, we'd love to hear from you on the usual address, aljazeera.net/English. That's it from me. And until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you.